So I woke up this morning to some really big news, and that's the fact that Nvidia has acquired roughly 5% of Intel with a recent $5 billion cash injection via the form of buying up Intel common stock. Now, what we see here is there is about 215 million shares that have been acquired at this $5 billion purchase price, and essentially in total existence there's 4.38 billion shares outstanding for Intel, so this is where I get roughly that 5% figure from. And with this deal comes essentially Nvidia and Intel inking in two pretty big statements that the internet is starting to go a little bit crazy over. There's a lot of, speculation of what's to come. The Intel stock itself, that has gone up pretty much 25% overnight. So Nvidia being the market leader currently in tech, collaborating with Intel, I guess a lot of people are seeing this as a big threat to AMD. And now we're going to talk about that big threat to AMD in today's video. But I will say, first of all, for TSMC, I don't really think this is a huge threat here, simply because Nvidia themselves don't have a lot of experience in terms of actually designing the process of the node itself. Rather, as Jensen has said in the past in live streams, Nvidia is essentially the kitchen, TSMC is like the ingredients. But when it comes to the kitchen of AMD, Nvidia's definitely got their own kitchenware experience there, and they can provide that with Intel, and that can bring some serious competition, at least to the CPU side of things. But we'll talk about this a little bit later, because this comes from two big statements in the Intel press release, where there's the first one we're going to go over here is that Intel will build Nvidia custom x86 CPUs that Nvidia will integrate into its AI infrastructure platforms and offer to market. So what we're seeing here is that essentially perhaps the ARM CPUs that Nvidia has been designing recently don't have exactly what Nvidia needs to scale up, as opposed to x86 having a lot more in the tank, at least for raw performance, especially when it comes to integrating it with their Nvidia AI platforms. So Nvidia wants access to this, but I do believe there's an ulterior motive as well here, and that of course is the elusive x86 license, which only 3 companies in the world currently hold for essentially a non-conflicting x86 license. So let's talk about Nvidia wanting to get their hands on this license and what this means for the end PC gamer, at least in the next few years. Right after today's video sponsor. Do you need to get Windows activated and don't want to spend stupid amounts of money on a key? Well, if that's you, then today's video sponsor SCD Keys has you covered. For as little as $21 for Windows 11 Pro or $13 for Windows 10 Enterprise, you can get activated instantly. And also, don't forget to use the coupon code BFTYC for a big juicy discount. Links in description below. Welcome back to Tech Yes City. Now, when it comes to Nvidia and making acquisitions, it seems like they cannot acquire ARM. But when we look over to what Intel's got right now, yeah, it's okay. They can acquire a part of Intel. I mean, the double standards here is kind of eye-opening, but really what we're seeing here with Intel is a company that I believe is desperate for cash. They're making these deals even with the US government. We recently actually covered this topic. I'll put the link to that video up here if you want to check it out, where essentially the US government acquired 10% of Intel, and they actually made their own more favorable deal, with now Nvidia piling on after the fact and raising that initial $20 purchase price for the US government. They've essentially made 50% on their investment. That's one of the quickest turnarounds. I mean, return on investment there is insane considering the time frame. So the US government definitely has got in quick and made a pretty good deal. But looking at Nvidia this time around, with them acquiring about 5%, there's also, of course, these ulterior motives for Nvidia wanting to get involved with Intel. And that in particular, of course, for them is scaling up their AI platforms, potentially making them a lot more powerful in relation to the CPU side of things. And that's where they're going to get their custom infrastructure and a custom CPU designed by Intel. But I do believe here Nvidia's design team is going to have a lot more say in this CPU design than we would be led to at least now believe here, where Intel is building it. I would actually say that we could cross out perhaps that Intel and put Nvidia will build Nvidia's custom x86 CPUs that Nvidia will integrate into its AI infrastructure platforms and offer to market. So that's where I believe this whole collaboration is going, where Nvidia wants access to that elusive x86 license, where only Intel, AMD, and a company called VIA Technologies has access to. In terms of VIA acquiring their license, we actually took a look at a Chinese CPU that was collaborating with VIA to use their license in the past, and we saw that it was just pretty much a nothing burger at the time. And I do believe to this date, it's not really in the forefront of sort of groundbreaking CPU performance. So that one didn't really pan out in terms of providing any competition for gamers at the very least. But now that we look at Nvidia having access, at least via the form of collaboration, to this x86 license, we can indeed see that perhaps they would be stepping up to the plate and not just designing a CPU for their AI infrastructure, but even perhaps bringing it to the consumer market against the likes of AMD. Now, how we're sort of hinting at this is the next big statement that was made on the press release. And I'll read it out to you guys here, where it says, "For personal computing, Intel will build and offer to the market x86 SoCs that integrate Nvidia RTX GPU chiplets. These new x86 RTX SoCs will power a wide range of PCs that demand integration of world-class CPUs and GPUs." So this one's a really powerful statement. I believe this is more powerful, especially for gamers, than the first statement. And so when I initially read this, the first thing that came to my mind was, oh no, is this essentially going to spell the end for Intel's Arc GPUs? And this is where I believe, yes, I do believe the Intel Arc GPUs just did not have anywhere near the market penetration that Intel had hoped for, especially when they released Alchemist, and then followed by Battlemage. I believe Battlemage just didn't make much of a dent, or at least as much as Intel would hope, despite the B580 being actually quite a decent graphics card for gamers. I believe it was ultimately just left behind in terms of its driver development, them using DirectX over Vulkan, rather than just going down the full driver optimization route versus that of Nvidia and AMD. They essentially just picked the easy way out, and this, I guess, for me personally, spanned through the rest of their drivers, in not just their optimization for a lot of older titles and niche titles, but also when it came to just the appearance and things like the bugs that I had in their software over the last couple of years trying out their GPUs personally. But what I believe we'll be looking at here is going to be, at least on the top priority, is something like they released years ago. I believe it was about 7 years ago they released it. It was the i7-8809G. That was the Hades Canyon NUC. And at the time, I believe they integrated a Vega and Intel 8th Gen i7 together in a custom SoC. And so you'll see something like that definitely hit the laptop market, as well as the small form factor market and NUC market, where Intel's going to have their CPUs combined with RTX GPUs in a custom SoC solution. And this should definitely be a good thing for the laptop market and people who like smaller footprints and getting the most out of their hardware. And so for Intel, on that point of view, that will definitely help them in terms of building their market share back up in the laptop market, as well as the small form factor market. But another thing is here is, I think for Nvidia, they won't really care here. They've got their RTX GPUs where they just can't get enough of the silicon to even sell to the gamers, where the AI demand is just still gobbling that all up. And we're still seeing this reflected in the price, especially of those higher end RTX GPUs. For instance, the RTX 5090 still commanding a well over MSR premium in most parts of the world. And if you do see it come on sale, especially near MSRP, it's pretty much quickly sold out. So what we've just laid out there is everything that at least I can see on the surface with this deal going forward. But another thing I want to talk about here is just the frequency of these stock sales from Intel. It does, for me personally, signal that Intel is financially in trouble. I mean, they're selling off stakes of their company to the government, and they're selling it off now, a stake of their company to Nvidia, all within the last few months. This is really desperate, and this reeks of a company that essentially just doesn't have the cash flow at this point in time, and so they're getting desperate for cash before, I mean, the worst case scenario would be if they don't have the cash flow, they'd have to file for bankruptcy, which that would just send the stock price to practically zero. Anyhow, I hope that there's, I guess, the accounting side of things, there's nothing dodgy going on here, like one of those infamous examples of like Enron back in the day. But it does definitely just, for me personally, when I see this news coming out one piece after one piece, and there are these massive announcements and these massive cash injections for Intel, it does spell desperation from their point of view. And we have seen this on the surface as well. When we look at marketplaces like Amazon and different sales trends, we can see that AMD is just absolutely clearing the floor when it comes to CPU sales versus Intel, at least on the consumer desktop side of things. And I do believe in the server market, they have gained a lot of share, that is AMD versus Intel. But then on the GPU side of things with Intel's Arc launch, that has been, from a financial perspective, a complete disaster for Intel. So them essentially selling off parts of their company to the US government and then selling off parts of their company to Nvidia does mean that they are getting desperate for cash. And who knows what could happen in the next year with this company. I do believe there are some spiders buried away in the closet here, and I do think they will come to surface in the next year. I do personally believe that there's just something really off with the frequency of what is happening at Intel and sort of the shifts and changes here that they're making. And I found it funny that they're now sort of acquiring at least a 30-year veteran in ARM. They've recently acquired this key staff member to come on board, and that's a focus on data center. And so when I look at an acquisition like this, it does look like they're going to work really closely with Nvidia to really prioritize that data center and get that custom solution for Nvidia top notch and essentially try and sell as much as possible on that front. But then the SoCs as well, if they can definitely make those as efficient as possible, I could see them offering and clawing back some market share from AMD in this particular field. Though the last thing that I want to talk about here is ultimately the competition to AMD. And as we talked about with TSMC, but with TSMC, I think they're in a league of their own right now. They don't really have anything to worry about, despite news outlets saying that they do believe that TSMC could be in some kind of trouble. I don't think there's any real big threat coming from this Nvidia 5% acquisition of Intel. And that's because Nvidia, as we said before, is essentially the kitchen. They're not in the business of competing directly with TSMC. Even though Intel is in direct competition with TSMC for the foundry part, I don't believe Nvidia has as much knowledge to offer as they do, as opposed to designing an architecture itself like they've done with their GPUs and even their ARM CPUs. And this leads us on to the last point of today's video, and that is the competition that's going to be going up against AMD. Now, AMD have been doing phenomenally well, especially on the CPU front. In fact, the AMD CPU front is carrying the business a huge amount here. They've experienced some insane growth over the last few years, but their GPU department has sort of, especially when it comes to consumer grade GPUs like RDNA 4 and RDNA 3, they have been pretty good. I've personally liked especially RDNA 4 and what's coming out of that. However, on this CPU front, this is where the biggest challenge lies ahead for AMD, and that is if Nvidia comes to the table and then gets a real strong grip on that x86 license and is managing to do something with it to then bring some huge competition to AMD, essentially in the guise of what would be a collaboration. But really, Nvidia could want their hands on that x86 license, and this may be a legitimate way that they can finally get access to it. And so that's what I feel there is the underlying key here. When we look past the surface and all that news there, when we look underneath it all, there is that x86 license, and it's actually spoken about quite a few times. Even these two main statements that we broke down here today, x86 is mentioned, I believe, 3 times. And for me, when I subconsciously see x86, x86, it makes it so that I believe it is one of, if not the, actual main focus of Nvidia collaborating with Intel and acquiring roughly 5% of their company. Anyway, going forward, AMD, they just need to keep doing what they're doing. I do believe they are going really hard on both the CPU front and the GPU front. I have had no problems with either of their combinations of CPUs and GPUs. I think this is actually the best time in history that AMD has been doing personally for a gamer. I think their X3D products are awesome for gaming. And then their RDNA 4, as I've said in a previous video, this was literally the best experience I've had on a Radeon GPU to date. So if they just keep doing what they're doing and keep focusing on improving their GPUs and improving their CPUs, then it doesn't matter what competition Nvidia and how much money Nvidia wants to throw at the problem. When you've just got that momentum and you've got that secret sauce and you constantly just bring the best to the market, the consumers will keep buying it. And ultimately, with the GPUs, perhaps things could even turn in favor for RDNA 5 if AMD really keeps on focusing and hammering down on just keeping those drivers really stable, as well as bringing that efficiency in direct competition to Nvidia. And with all that out of the way, do let us know in the comments section below what you think of Nvidia's recent acquisition, or at least 5% acquisition of Intel, and what do you think this is going to spell in terms of competition, especially against AMD. And I think this is the main thing to come out of this if you're a PC gamer. What is this going to spell in the next few years? I definitely think as well, if you've got an Arc GPU and it's your main GPU, you may want to think of a backup plan, especially if you're using it as a work GPU and perhaps Intel abandons the Arc GPU, they're essentially going to abandon the drivers as well for that. That's a big one where they just cut costs and they'll just say, nope, no more Arc GPUs, cutting the drivers off, and then that's support all done. So that's a possibility as well. Whenever I try to undervolt this card, I'm having the same problems that I previously had when the card was first released. That is, any custom settings I set in the curve in the Intel software, it just essentially resets, and it's bizarre. And in the fact of overclocking on this card, you'll notice in the graphs too that there's no results there, because every time I try to set the power limit higher, the card just crashed out completely. And this was with also no memory OC too. So the drivers over 6 months later for the Intel, it shows for me personally that it's almost, I'm not going to say it's this bad, but it feels like it's this bad. It feels like an abandonment from the driver team in terms of the B580, and then really going into the software, optimizing it and fixing bugs. And it just feels like the bugs that I've looked at over 6 months ago, are still present in the B580. And when we look at the popular multiplayer titles, it feels like they could do a lot more in terms of optimization, especially in these popular multiplayer titles, to get the card really up to speed and just getting more FPS out of it, especially at lower resolutions like 1080p. And this is actually a thing that I believe is gaining more weight and more traction, especially when we read this news here that Intel is not making their own custom SoC with their own GPUs. Anyhow, love reading your thoughts and opinions as always, and I'll catch you in another tech video very soon. Hope you enjoyed this one. Peace out for now. Bye.